Has the pandemic and the work from home movement it ushered in set the stage for a fundamental shift, or were these trends already underway? And what does all of this have to do with the idea of personalization? On today's Digital Experience Revolution, we'll find out. All right, everybody. Thanks for joining us for another episode of the Digital Experience Revolution. And we're going to dive right in with this week's trending topic, Frank. And here's the trend line: the future of virtual events. So we, of course, always record these a few weeks ahead of time. And so this will be slightly old news by the time you get this. But there's been a couple events recently that sort of were these aha moments for me. The first happened about a week ago, and it was Snap's partner keynote, I think they call it, or partner event. And Fast Company actually wrote an article, and its headline was, "Steve Jobs was famous for his Apple keynotes. Snap just topped him." And I just found it fascinating. I'm not a Snap user, a Snapchat, if you don't know who they are, right? I'm not a Snapchat user, and so I really wasn't plugged into this. But it made me go watch this partner summit, or at least the opening keynote.
Right.
And it was sort of mind-blowing. In fact, it made me remember, it brought back memories of something from almost 20 years ago, which I'll share in just a second. But it truly did change, I think, not only the essence of their keynote itself, which sort of had that, made you feel the Steve Jobs Apple keynotes back in the day, but more than that, it was also highly indicative of this pandemic virtual world or period of time that we're in. And if you haven't watched it, and I highly recommend you go check it out. Basically, they were on, I guess, some kind of a studio stage with a massive green screen, and everything was projected. Other than the actual speakers, everything else was projected onto the screen, and it was just a fascinating experience. Not to be outdone, yesterday, as we're recording this on June 23rd, yesterday, Apple did their Worldwide Developers Conference, and of course also virtual from the Steve Jobs Hall or auditorium, whatever they call it, at their new campus. And they also did a spectacular event, and they made a point of showing their empty auditorium because there was, of course, nobody there. But they just nailed it. I mean, not only am I an Apple fanboy, admittedly, but I mean, the production value and how they presented, the fact that they tore down all the walls and it was open to everybody, just truly, I think these two events have set the stage for what we're going to see in the future around virtual events. So I think that's kind of the trend line. And I think it's really impactful as we start thinking about what are the kind of big takeaways around all of this.
And I think what you were saying at the top is this always been there as we are able to do it, and we just have been forced into doing it? I'm kind of looking at it as the consumerization of video and virtual events, where you don't need an elaborate production to do these things. I mean, somebody could do something in their home with multiple cameras and green screens. They even sell those green screens, and we could make a webinar in my home look like an interesting, world-class event. So the consumerization of this has been really thrust upon us, is the way I look at it.
Well, what I think is interesting about it is that you're right. It's not that this wasn't a big technology breakthrough that caused this. And in fairness, right, all these events, right, whether it's Snap or Apple or any of the other countless events that have been going on, it's not like they weren't big productions. They were just big in-person productions, and they might stream it, but I mean, I don't know if you ever sat through one of those. They were not great experiences. They were just
streaming was almost like an afterthought, and for somebody who just couldn't quite be there, we'll just make it available to you on camera. Ooh, isn't that neat? But we've taken that.
And so everyone at the beginning of this pandemic, when we had to suddenly go to these virtual events, there was this big, like, what do we do? And the very first ones, well, they were mostly just horrible. They were basically just webinars strung together. And then the sort of next round, I would say the first one that sort of broke ground on that was Adobe, their event, I think, and it was right at the beginning, and I gave them a lot of props at the time. And it was all the executives mostly in their living rooms, and but they would have some interspersing of videos, and it was a much better event. But these two events, I think, have set the new norm. And you said something important, right, about the consumerization of it. And so my big takeaway here, the first one is production value, is that what they have shown is exactly what you said, is that it can't be an afterthought. This can't just be something you cobble together, that you have to transform the virtual experience for our new reality. And I think what I think is going to be fascinating about this is I think it's going to set the stage for in the future where people go, hey, I can do a virtual event. Maybe I don't need to do this live event, because we can truly change the way this is done. And you have a great story about the consumerization, because you actually did a cooking thing where you did a lot of this, right?
Right. I started out, I did a cooking class over Zoom because that's what I did. That's what I do. And I ended up adding cameras to my Zoom session. And when I moved from my countertop to the stove, I switched cameras to overhead point of view. I switched camera to my stove so people could see me actually working at the stove. And then I had a wide angle camera so you could see my face as I spoke, and I interspersed some graphics and PowerPoints to give to give a full-on presentation, almost like and it was really interesting, really well received. And I had my wife doing the production work for me. If somebody wanted a question or a comment, they would chat in on Zoom, and she would relay the question to me. It was a full-on production, true consumerization, albeit at a lower level. But back to your point, these kinds of virtual events, or these kinds of events, virtual, should now be, or is getting to be, the primary delivery mechanism.
Yeah. So I think the first big takeaway, virtual events, if you have, and I think we're going to be in this state at least through the end of this year, probably well into next year, that you need to be changing the way you approach it, and production value is going to be critical. The second big takeaway, as I looked at these two events, were that issues matter. Both of them, Snap and Apple, both opened their events addressing the social issues that are going on right now, both the pandemic as well as the social unrest that we've been experiencing.
Mm-hmm.
And they did it differently. Snap spent a lot more time on it than Apple did. And neither of them really dwelled on it. I wouldn't say they pandered on it. But I think what was interesting from my perspective is what it speaks to is the importance of the customer intimacy that you and I, Frank, have been talking about for a long time, that I think is starting to really come to fruition in terms of the fact that this experience, that the experience that we have with these companies that we deal with, it's not just about the product, right? You can't use, and it's certainly true of things like an Apple iPhone or Snapchat, but I think even more broadly, it's very difficult to use any product in isolation, right? And so we're always consuming that product or service in the context of what's going on around us. And so I think, issues matter now.
And it just dawned on me as you were talking. We didn't even go over this in pre-prod, but a corporate social responsibility. This really falls into that. That corporate social responsibility used to be kind of one of those things that you devote time to, but basically now that of customer intimacy, organizations and companies cannot be deaf and blind to current events. They have to at least be sensitive to them. And that's what we're really finding out.
Yeah, and I think, and to your point, in the past it was about politics, meaning about, positioning organizationally, and that's why you often found it in these ivory tower groups of whatever. But I think what it really is now is that it's important to customers, which means if you're going to have an authentic relationship with your customer,
that's it.
You be recognizing the things that are important to them on a much deeper
transcendent level. You need to be sensitive to it, and you need to be authentic in your response. You can't just pander because you want to make a sale or what have you. But you have to be authentic, and people know that. They will sense authenticity, and that's a good point.
Yeah, and you brought up a point in our planning around this where you said that isn't necessarily to say you have to make a stand, and I agree, right? It's I like in Snap's case, Snap took a much more definitive stand than say Apple did in theirs. But what I think is interesting is that that's a reflection of your relationship with your customer, right?
Exactly.
And so it has to be authentic, to your point.
Absolutely.
The last point that I wanted to bring up was this idea of the virtual future. So when I was watching the Snap one, I had this just flashback. It was amazing to a product that is 17 years old and apparently is still around. I didn't actually know this, but I went and looked it up, and it's a website or a product, I guess, called Second Life. And Second Life effectively is this virtual world where you create your own avatar, and I have not been I've not used it in 17 years, so I know very little about it in terms of its current. So if you're a fan of it, don't slam me on this. But but it was fascinating because one of the things when this whole idea, Second Life and other virtual worlds at the time, 15, 20 years ago, were starting to come around, people were talking about it then, about the future of events, that we could put on our avatar and we could go to this event and interact with people, et cetera, et cetera. And it never took off. And as I'm watching this Snap showcase, it was like, wow, this is sort of like what we were promised 15, 20 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And even though this wasn't a virtual world and it wasn't an avatar, it had that same sort of feel, because they had, like I said, they had this massive green screen. Everything was projected. It was like they're on a beach in Malibu or something.
Right.
And it was just this wild experience. And then there's another kind of salient point is that in April, Fortnite put on a concert by the rapper Travis Scott and attracted 12.3 million people to this virtual experience. And so, I think as we look forward, and this is a question as much as it is anything, but are we going to see a broader embrace of this sort of avatar-based approach in it, but in a different kind of way, maybe? Because both the Snap and the Apple events had that sort of feel of, I was experiencing it much differently than like you said, the streaming things we've seen in the past.
Yeah, and I can definitely see the application here and how it would catch on, and again, for practical use. And secondly, a lot of the stay-at-home, I guess, has we need some sort of outlet, and so where do we go? Can we go on vacation, in this Second Life or something like that? So I can see that how this would actually have legs in many different areas. And in some of my earlier writings for the Institute, I dealt with some ethical questions, and just to touch upon it here, I don't think it's a long walk to some ethical gray areas on this Second Life, but I get the application for concerts and seminars and webinars and conferences and whatnot. Very, very powerful stuff.
So yeah, look, I don't know if this is where it's going to end up, but I do think what these are all indicative of, to me, is that we're on the cusp of a reimagining of this.
Mm-hmm.
So the virtual event conceptually has been sort of stagnated, it's been stuck. And I think we're going to see a fundamental transformation of what it means to host a virtual event. And this might be the tipping point where we finally start seeing them put be in the running, and where you might have a legitimate conversation about, does it make more sense to do a virtual event versus a live event, and that it's not this like, oh, of course you would do a live event.
Yeah. Well, I can tell you that if I'm going to use an avatar, I'm going to make it look better than I look, so that's fine.
Isn't that reason enough to go? I mean, I might, I'm going to go into Second Life just so I can pretend I have hair again, So, all right. So that is our trend line, the future of virtual events. Chime in. I'd love to hear what you have to think or think about this. I think, Frank and I are kind of riffing on it, but it would be fun to kind of get your take on, have you used Second Life? Have you used Avatar? Do you think that this is where this is going? So let us know what you think. But that is our trend line for this week. And now it's time for Tech Notes, where we talk about the emerging companies or I guess I should say technology companies that are doing interesting, exciting things. Some of those are emerging, some are longstanding. And today we're actually going to talk only about a single company. We often talk about two, but there is so much meat on this bone that we're going to be gnawing on it for a little while. So I'm calling the segment the market of one via applied data, and this will make sense in a second. So the company that we're going to talk about today is a company called DeCuda, and I'm pretty sure I'm saying their name right. And so they consider themselves the anti-segmentation company. And if you're at all familiar with the marketing world, it's, you know, market segmentation has sort of been the thing for a really long time. We identify personas, and I'm not a marketing expert by any stretch, right? But we identify personas, we create these market segments, and we are able to kind of stick everyone in these buckets. And fundamentally, their entire approach is the opposite, that every customer is an individual and that you need to understand their specific state of mind so that you can engage with them based on that understanding individually. And that sounds great. All of us would nod our head naturally and go, of course, I'm, you know, as a customer, I'm an individual, right? But there's a couple pieces to that. The first is that there's always the creepy factor we have to worry about. It's like, yeah, I want all that, but if you're a machine, you know, I don't want you to know all this stuff about me, and, you know, necessarily that it gets creepy.
Right.
And then secondly,
there's privacy issues that you
right?
need to be sensitive to. Yep.
So there's always that piece. But then the second part is just fundamentally, this stuff is hard. It is, you know, it's easy if, you know, if you're a small organization and you've got 100 customers, you can interact with them individually. You got 1 million customers, this becomes a data problem, right? And so what you find as soon as you sort of dig under the covers of DeCuda is that that's exactly what they are. In fact, what they have what they call an unstructured data analysis engine, but they call this a data refinery. And I love the term, right? If we think of like an oil refinery, you take this sort of crude source and you refine it into a usable resource. And that's how they see what they do. So in a nutshell, I'm not gonna, it's a fairly complex thing, so we're not gonna get too deep into this, but basically they take signals or little bits of data, both from transactional and traditional structured customer data sources like CRMs and sales data and support data, et cetera, as well as unstructured, what they call voice of the customer data. And that can be everything from surveys to transcripts coming from call centers to social media interactions to chat records, even like videos that you could engage with customers on social, ask them to record a video, and they actually deconstruct all of that unstructured data and feed it in. And so they go through this process of enriching, the refining process. Is that how you say that?
Refining. Yeah, refining.
Refining. That's the right word. Refining. I knew that wasn't refining. That didn't sound right. So the refining process, and put it into this, what they call a reservoir, which they describe as a database of customer databases, meaning rather than having this idea, I mean, this was sort of mind-blowing for me as far as having to try to get my head around this. Instead of this idea where we say, well, here's my database with all my customers in it. What they really view it is, because they're trying to view each customer individually, is that effectively as a customer, you have your own database. Right? And this database is filled with all these signals, all these little parts and pieces that represent your quote unquote state of mind. And then this reservoir is a database of those databases, right? So on top of that, I know I'm giving this a whole lot. I told you there's a lot of meat on this bone. And then on top of that, that's where they apply all of these cognitive models, right? So all the AI pieces to it. So there's one last piece that's their secret sauce, but let me pause and just take a breath here. I mean, does that make sense? Is this all connecting?
Yeah, I like to put this in Frank speak. And if you're looking at a customer, either for a sale or somebody you have a relationship with, why are some salespeople more successful than others? What verbal, social, physical cues do they get from their customer? And can that be codified in that tribal knowledge? And I was watching a news magazine show last week, and they were talking about sales and whatnot. And there are certain salesmen who are just excellent, and there are customer service representatives that are just excellent because they have those instincts. They understand the verbal, social, and physical cues. And can you teach that? Yes, you can teach it, but can you codify it and institutionalize that teaching so that now it becomes a commodity, and that tribal knowledge, if you were. And that's the Frank speak way of explaining what's going on here. I thought it was fascinating.
Well, so it's interesting is, so when he was explaining all this, because there's a lot of companies that talk about signaling and getting data from lots of places and normalizing and enriching it and all of that, right? And so I asked him that exact question, and he described effectively sort of what you're talking about, is that they call it their common sense knowledge base. But and I'm not sure it's a great name, actually, because I mean, it is on one level common sense, but to your point, it's actually a lot because common sense implies something that we all know, right? But to your point, that this is the stuff that are these really, the tribal knowledge is the perfect term, but these little things that we don't even recognize. Malcolm Gladwell actually talked about this years ago. I forgot the name of the dang book. I should have looked it up. But I related to a story with my father. My father, for those of you that have been my fans, probably have heard all my stories about him. But LA County Sheriff for 30 years, ran SWAT teams, all kinds of specialized teams. Well, at one point, when he was a watch commander, which is a lieutenant in charge of a station when the captain is gone, so typically at night, and he'd come in as watch commander. And when he got there, he told all of his crews before they go out to check all their riot gear. Now that was pretty, there's a routine check that happens with them, but to have them do a double check of all the riot gear was a pretty odd thing. So they all checked the riot gear because he told them to do so. They all went out, and sure enough, that night a riot breaks out. And so of course they respond, and at the end of it, they're all regrouping.
You know? How did you know?
Seriously, they're like, how in the heck did you know? And he said, I don't know. But as he thought about it, he realized that there was these signals that the Santa Ana wind conditions in Southern California, Santa Ana wind conditions are hot summer nights where the wind blows offshore and it's warm, and the heat was up, and there was a full moon. And those three signals, he didn't really connect the dots like intellectually, but instinctively he knew that those three things often meant that it was a little bit of a crazy night. And so he didn't really process that. But if somebody had asked him, hey, how would you know if you might want to check your riot gear because something might happen? And if they asked him enough, he would do exactly what you said the salespeople were doing, which is, well, these are the signals. These are the things that are indicative of it. And so, long way around, I told you we're going to ramble on this one, because that's what DeCuda does. They actually send out, and I don't know all the details of how this works, but they send out this automated question and answer thing to basically build that common sense database, to ask about what those signals. How would somebody know that a customer is likely or not likely to buy? How would they know that they are likely or not likely to cancel their service? How would they know if they're likely or unlikely to do any of these things? And so it ends up becoming this sort of organization-specific custom context that they're able to then now take all these signals and make sense of them.
And proof that tribal knowledge can be codified. You mentioned full moon. Well, there is science behind wacky events happening on full moons, hence the term lunatic. There's your trivia for today.
Okay. Yeah.
So lunatic, lunar orbit. It's lunatic comes from strange events, or somebody who would do some sort of strange event or act crazy at a full moon. Lunatic. There you go.
And what I think is interesting is we have these lunatic moments in all of our organizations, in the bad sense and not so bad sense, right? But all these things are unique. And what I think is interesting and fairly unique to DeCuda is that they are actually addressing that, right? They're not just treating these signals as homogenous. And then the last little piece that they do, which I think is absolutely amazing and fascinating and cool, is that they have the ability to do both micro and macro sort of processing. So for instance, they had one customer where they did the customer did a social campaign asking people to record videos about what they, their experience with the product. And that's all great all in and of itself. But what was really interesting is they then took that data, they transcribed it and processed it and turned it into signals that then improve their models, and I believe actually specifically helped build out the customer databases of these specific people. And then they also automatically do things like transcribing every publicly held earnings call at the macro end of the spectrum to kind of feed that into these models. So I just really love the approach and how they're addressing all of this.
Yeah, very powerful. Very powerful stuff. Very powerful stuff.
Yeah, and it just speaks to how interconnected all of this has to be to actually work. So, okay, with that, let's tie it all back, as we always do, to our research on the digital experience supply chain. So, Frank, what is your kind of take as we look at all of these things we've talked about today so far? and how it connects to our research.
Yeah, and it very tightly connects to our research, and I talk about the customer experience and awareness and whatnot. What we're talking about today seems to very well resonate in that supply chain step we call experience monitoring and management, and specifically experience optimization and tuning. And so what do I mean by that? Well, digital experience or supply chain requires companies to be what we call vanguards of the customer experience. So it's more than just knowing the customer experience, but also internally making it a 360-degree customer satisfaction experience. And not only that, significantly, you want to reward employees who implement customer experience programs and go beyond it. And this really leads to prosperity of the company and customer satisfaction. So we're talking about transcending, we talk about transcendence, so to speak, and the customer experience. That's now a 360-degree thing that we see in experience optimization and tuning. And that's a capability that organizations and companies are going to need in the digital experience supply chain.
Yeah, so for me, what I think is interesting that as we continue to do this research, and we're still at the early stages of it, I'm actually pretty confident that we're going to find that these two terms start really kind of intersecting with this as we see it, right? And the first is this idea of context, and the second is this idea of transcendence. So if, and I think that not only, obviously we just spent a lot of time talking about DeCuda and the fact that they provide this context, but really it's this idea of context within, when we talk about virtual events, is the same, right? I think some of the missteps in the early days was that people looked at these virtual events without context. They said, oh, it's just, we're doing it the same way we've always done either webinars or the same way we'll try to, right? Instead of recognizing that the context matters and that the experience is different, so therefore I have to adjust how we execute against that. So I think the context is first, and then the second is this idea of transcendence, and you nailed it, is that I can't look at even an element of that experience in isolation. I have to look at that experience across that spectrum, and to your point, how the employees impact it. And we didn't talk about it, but DeCuda can help with some of that too on the back end of that, and all the way through the multiple steps of the journey. So they're playing there. And this also goes back to when we talk about issues matter, right? That's that whole same idea of transcendence of the experience. And so I think it is really, really fascinating as we put all of this together that, all of this has to fit together, that we create these types of experiences that if you're going to create this type of experience that is going to be what differentiates you in the marketplace, which is the whole premise of the digital experience supply chain, it's you have to break out of this box of sort of trying to put this neat little bow on what the experience is and recognize that it demands context and this transcendence.
Right. And when I talk to Vanguard, it means 360, not just organization to the customer, but 360 also to your employees and creating that Vanguard experience. And that's the key.
So I think as we wrap this up today, the answer to the question when we opened the show was that, yes, these shifts have been underway. These were all happening long before the pandemic. But I think the pandemic is not only accelerating them, but it is also shining a bright light on both their impact and their, for the good or for the bad. And so all of this comes together, and in the end, it's always going to be a market of one. It's always going to come down to this idea, do I feel in the end that you are seeing me not as a machine or as a number or as a cog or as a sale, but are you seeing me as an individual? Do you care about the things that I care about, and can you communicate that to me? And those are going to be the essence of the experience. It has nothing to do with the technology. It's going to come down to that every single time.
Agreed.
So with that, I think we are done. So another show in the books. Appreciate you being with us for this episode of Digital Experience Revolution. For Dr. Frank Granito, I'm Charles Rajo, and we will see you next time.